So, hello everybody. Today I would like to talk about realism in games and especially in role-playing games. Now, a lot of people who don't know about gaming will find this probably quite odd, saying, well, you're playing a game, how real can it be? If it's real, then it's a simulation, and even simulations leave a lot to be desired with regard to realism, because even in a simulation, if you make a couple of bad decisions, you will still not be, let's say, impacted negatively, unless, of course, the simulation is part of an assessment where they then decide whether they give you a job or something. But I would like to say that everyone who has ever played a role-playing game will be able to relate to the question as to how much realism would you like to have in your game. And over the last decades of role-playing, I've come to the conclusion that I'm somewhat of a realism junkie. I find it very easy to suspend my disbelief in general. I'm very happy to read books that are completely unrealistic, that deal with topics that we will never see happen. I'm happy to buy into Star Trek saying that you can go faster than light. We all know you can't. These are all things that I can live with. But when it comes to actually playing a game, I can still suspend this part of my disbelief. I'm totally happy to play Ashen Stars, which is a space opera style RPG where you have to travel faster than light in order for you to get from A to B to Z. But I still feel that I can only play a game if I have a world that I can believe in. And that can be as big as a universe or as big as a galaxy, or it can be as small as the village that I happen to live in and the village that maybe the story that I'm playing in is taking place in. Now, what makes such a place real to me? Well, one of the things that always makes it a lot easier for myself to believe in something is if I have pictures. Maps go a long way to making things real for me. It's like this childish understanding. If there is a map, then ergo they must have drawn the map to represent a real place. Of course, we all know that this isn't the case. And people have been drawing maps of Atlantis for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and we all know that Atlantis isn't real. And I'm now looking at a map of Aventuria, which is the world or the continent really that much of DSA is set in. And of course, it's a beautiful map and it's very detailed. But of course, Aventuria does not exist. However, maps go a long way towards establishing reality or realism. Then, of course, cultures that are developed, a history that is developed. Why do people act in certain ways? Why do certain people like certain other people? Why do they dislike a third group? How do groups work together, maybe fall out with each other? So something that resembles human history. Because I'm a history buff. I like reading about human history. The older the better, and I like to see how we came to where we are now. Maybe where we're going is less inspiring. And this actually is something that I want and that I crave. And I understand, on the other hand, that Tolkien was a once-in-a-lifetime genius when it comes to fictional world building, and we will never see his like again. And I don't expect any role-playing company to ever go to the lengths that he went to. I mean, creating languages and so on and so forth, because that was one man's work that he spread out over several decades of his life. And even at the end of his life, he hadn't finished. And Christopher Tolkien, his son, took the mantle from him and kept, the estate and his work alive by actually collating all of the stuff that was there and putting it in order. And I mean, the Silmarillion, although it was largely written by J.R.R. Tolkien himself, does owe portions of its cohesion to Christopher Tolkien's work. So I'm not looking for this kind of detail because I don't think it can be achieved. But I am looking for something that is cohesive, coherent, and consistent. And I need to feel depth. And so, for example, I just don't find that depth in Dungeons and Dragons. And I now know that people will go, oh yeah, but Forgotten Realms, but this, that, and the other, Greyhawk, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah, but that's just what I'm talking about. It is completely inconsistent worlds that were produced because people were just trying to do something else, or they were trying to pander to a fan base and they wanted to do this, they wanted to do that. Instead of just keeping it to one world and keeping developing this one world, they came up with these other worlds or realms, And I'm like, yeah, you can do it this way, but it's an easy cop-out. Oh yeah, that would be cool. We can't do it in this world because we've established at some point that this isn't possible, so we'll just create a new world. No, if you've made a decision that this isn't possible, then you will have to stick to it, or you will have to find a way of integrating it into the existing world. That doesn't mean that I don't enjoy D&D for what it is. It's a shallow experience when it comes to world building. Game mechanics aside, it's not a bad RPG game, and I've played plenty of Pathfinder, which is essentially 3.5, and of course D&D 5th edition and previous editions, Advanced D&D. But, it was never this, it was always more this, oh yeah, there's a dragon in there. We don't care why it is there, we'll just go in there and kill it. Which is hack and slay, dungeon crawling, and there's a place for this in my life, but I wouldn't call it, this is a fun game. You go there with a bag of crisps, and you roll some dice, and that's it. It's dice chucking. It's the Ameritrash version of an RPG game, if we were going to use board game terminology, whereas then you have the Euro games, which are different. So the One Ring, of course, is inspired and based on Tolkien's Middle-earth, which is a very Euro-gamey type of RPG, and I think maybe they kind of overdid it a little. Then, of course, you've got the big German ones, Midgard and DSA, and they, of course, are, if you like, the pinnacles of world building when it comes to RPGs, in my opinion, because they have been around for a long time, not as long as D&D, but they have been around in a very consistent manner. For example, Midgard was developed by a husband and wife team, and they still hold the IP and they still develop the game. They have made very small incremental changes to the game mechanics. They're now also on 5th edition, but the changes have been very, very minor. And although I've never played it, and it's less successful than DSA, it's older than DSA on the one hand, but also I think its fan base is a lot, I would say, more professional in a way. They are like, if you play Midgard, then you play Midgard and you inhabit this world. They are very, and I use the word hardcore in a very, very positive way. They inhabit this world and they know it inside out. And I think the fact that there was only ever 2 people really looking out and after the system, with authors coming in and writing for the system, but with, I would say, a lot of the editorial side still resting with the husband and wife team who first came up with the idea, which was based on a tabletop skirmishing game that they had, worked with, or maybe even developed, I'm not sure, previously. That shows. And DSA likewise, because one of the original inventors of DSA is still around today, and they have left such a strong legacy, and they have set the tone as to what works in DSA, what works in Aventuria and what doesn't. That doesn't mean that they didn't deviate from this path, because we have other worlds or other, they came up with this idea of a globule, which is kind of like a world protrusion, which protrudes from Dere, the world that DSA is set in, where different rules apply. So Tarun would be one of those. Then, of course, you've got 2 more continents, Muranor and Uturia. Uturia, which is not really well described. We're still waiting for a regional compendium, and I don't think we'll ever get it. But of course, Muranor is very well described, and it is very different from Aventuria, and it is so different that I read through it and I was like, this is too over the top for me. I don't like this, and I'm not playing it. Having said this, within its world, Murano is completely consistent and coherent. So it is totally believable. It's just that I, as a player, don't want to play in this world. But if I were the kind of target audience, I would totally be happy to play that because it is completely cohesive, coherent, and it works. So it's really well done. So world building, having a history, very important, maps, but even talking about trivial things as to not only the big epic battles, you know, such and such a realm fought such and such a realm, but what does a day in the life of such a person who lives there, maybe a peasant, look like? What do they do? Where do they worship? What kind of foods do they cook? What kind of drinks do they brew? What kind of gods do they worship? How do they worship them? What grows in those places? What kind of natural resources do they have, if they've got any? Do they build things? Do they make things? What kind of things do they make? Are they artists? What kind of art do they produce? And I would say that DSA is second to none in that regard because it's got 30 odd years of history, and you can still get the PDFs, and you can still, you know, see all of this and read all of the history, read all of the information about these places, this vast continent. And it is, again, completely consistent, comprehensive, and coherent. Having said this, of course, over almost 40 years, some inconsistencies have crept in. And if you go to the Wiki Aventurica, you sometimes read an entry where it says, well, there is an inconsistency here because in this book it says blah, and in that book it says something different. So these are just things to be aware of. It's unclear which of the readings is correct. But then again, you could say, depending on what kind of a topic it is, well, different people saw different things or interpreted them differently. It's like when I introduced you to the Historia Aventurica, it basically says this is a bird's eye view with out-of-game knowledge that has been collated. But no one person in Aventuria knows it all. You know, and some things may actually be inconsistent or inaccurate because they were put together with the background of this type of person or that type of person, and they may see the same thing in different ways. You know, there is the saying that we don't see things how they are, we see things how we are. And of course, they try to put this in there, which makes it a really good read and a very, very good book. But it also can be used to explain away, if you like, inconsistencies which you might see when you look at different publications from that game. And of course, this world building aspect mainly applies to games where a world has been built. So, you know, if you play Call of Cthulhu, the aspect of realism is entirely different because Call of Cthulhu usually is set in our world. And it is usually set in a historical period that is either happening now, Cthulhu now, or maybe in the Second World War, Achtung Cthulhu, or in the classic Cthulhu area in the 1920s. Then you also have Cthulhu Invictus, that's set in Roman times. But these are all real eras where we know what the world was like. And especially Pegasus has gone to great lengths to document these eras. And also, I would say, Édition Sans Détour, I've got their Nyarlathotep case. It's a bookcase with information and the whole game in it in French. So my French isn't too good, but I just wanted to own the books because they were so beautifully done. And they have taken great lengths, for example, to explain what 1920s United States was like. I was born in 1973 in Germany. You know, I need to read up on these things in order to understand it. Cthulhu Invictus is a lot less new to me because I studied Latin for 7 years, so I know all about the Roman world. So I would have to read up less. But what they do is they say, okay, and this is the premise of Cthulhu, it is our world, it is real, the world is real, and the description of the world is real. you are a real person who lives in that world. You are a normal person. You don't usually have any superpowers or any powers whatsoever. You're a librarian. You're a flapper girl. You're a medic. You're a nurse. You own a powdered milk factory. You're an antiquarian, you're a dilettante, whatever. And you live in your world and you live your life. And suddenly these weird things, and I don't want to call them cosmic horror, but weird things start to happen. They slowly creep in. And then you start to discover strange things. And over time, you may or may not accept that there is something out there. And whatever that something is again, something that needs to be explained and discovered. Or you can also say, well, I'm out of here because this is creepy. I'm not playing a part in this. And I'm not saying you're not playing a part in the game, but your character may say, this is too scary. I'm out of here. In which case, you as the player would have to create another character, unless you as the player say, this is not my game. But here, the realism comes from the actual world, and there I think it is very important to distinguish between what the players know about the game itself, the game mechanism, and the objective of the game, which is to try not go insane in session 1, but try and prolong the road to insanity as long as possible, but probably at some point caving in completely and going crazy, or really ending up in a serious condition because you have just experienced so many traumatizing things that a return to normalcy isn't possible anymore. And here I would like to give an example of something that happened recently in my gaming group, where I was running a Call of Cthulhu game, and one person was playing a sheriff. So, and it was Cleveland, 1984, and he was the sheriff of Cleveland. There was also an FBI agent, and there was also an Egyptologist. It makes perfect sense if you know the adventure, although at the moment the makeup of the group seems to be quite eclectic. It makes perfect sense within the game. So, what happens is a child is abducted, and the abductor then returns to the scene of the crime, which is a shopping center, attacks a guard, shoots him and wounds him, then it's not quite clear in the beginning what he tries to do, but then he shoots himself in the face and dies. So he's dead. But he's got an accomplice who's sitting outside in a car, and he had deposited the girl with that accomplice in the car, and the accomplice drove away. So the girl is missing, the child's a girl, and you have got a dead body, you've got somebody who was shot at, and you're trying to piece together what's actually happened, what the hell is going on. You do know who the child is, so you have some leads, but that's as far as it goes. You have to find out who is the abductor, blah, 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 blah. And so they find out who the guy is who shot himself, and they go to his house, and it's immaculately clean. There is nothing there. In the garden, they find the remains of a huge bonfire where basically papers had been burnt. You can't find anything in there. The house is immaculately clean. There are no belongings there of any kind. I mean, there are no pictures on the walls, but there is furniture, there is a TV set, there is a phone, And in the basement, they find a weapons locker, which is locked. And when they open it, they find two things: a VHS tape and a box of bullets, which would fit the revolver that the guy shot himself with, and that was found at the scene. But nothing else. No evidence of anything, no evidence of a break-in, nothing. Not even a goodbye note, nothing. So, the sheriff then realizes that, or the group realizes that it's weird that this guy would have a VHS tape because there isn't a single VHS player in his home. So, what was he doing with it? Why was it locked in the basement locker? So, that's weird. So the sheriff decides to go back to the sheriff's station, and he decides to give this videotape to someone, an unnamed character who's a police officer. I'm like, okay, she'll watch it. So, and then he goes off and does something else. When he comes back, his secretary is sitting with the police officer who had been asked to watch the tape, and this police officer is hysterical and crying and incoherent and can't answer any questions. But she's the secretary has invited or has called she's called 911, and they're sending paramedics to look after this lady. So he basically says, okay, I'm going to the door and I'm listening. Can I hear if the tape's playing? And so, no, you can't hear anything. I mean, it's a big door, and I mean VHS. I've got several VHS recorders in my own home, and they're not that loud. So he's like, okay, well, I open the door and I peek in. I was like, yeah, well, you see nothing. So he goes in, he says, well, I want to read the notes that she took when she watched the video. I said, there are no notes. He's like, yeah, why didn't she take notes? Well, you told her to watch the video and report back. You didn't say anything about her taking notes. There are no notes. Okay. So he's like, okay, I'm going to get somebody else to watch the tape. And I said, okay, well, it's Saturday. You have just... I mean, this is a police department, but it's not like it's full of people. There aren't that many people that you can use, because they also have other duties. There are things that are happening. Cleveland, Ohio may not be the center of crime in the United States in 1984. I don't know, but it's unlikely that you have like 1 gazillion people at your disposal. He's like, yeah, I want somebody who's more robust. I said, okay, give me a luck roll. He rolls an extreme. And I say, okay, well, you find Officer Parker, or whatever his name was, I just made him up on the fly, and he's a Vietnam War veteran. He is as robust as they come. So he's like this huge guy, big guy, like has seen it all. And so he tells him there's a videotape, you watch it and you make notes. So he goes in, closes the door behind himself, starts watching the video. And after and then the paramedics arrive. They look after the hysterical police person, and then they hear a gunshot from the video viewing room. So the player of the sheriff turns around to the paramedics and says, "There was a shot fired. Go in there and take care of it." And so the paramedics reply, no, I mean, that's not our job. We look after injured people. We don't put ourselves in harm's way and go after a shooter. That's your job. And it was clear because of a remark that the player had made previously that he was totally metagaming this. I mean, he thought that this VHS tape was dangerous, and so he didn't want to watch it because obviously he didn't want to put himself in harm's way, his character, which of course means he's completely not playing the game. He's metagaming the game, so that's unacceptable anyway. So then he says, okay, well, I'm gonna take 2 officers and I'm gonna send them in. And I said, well, no, actually you don't have anyone left. You sent people on errands earlier. They are busy. They are traveling around Cleveland and its surrounding areas to track down people, and to track down a car, and to track down somebody who might have gone to a pharmacy. I don't know how many pharmacies there are in Cleveland in 1984 and surrounding areas, but I live in a village with 2,000 people, or well, it's almost a small town, and we have 6 pharmacies. So Cleveland probably has around 1,000 or so. So they're going to be busy for a while. And then he's like, okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go downstairs, because I had established that in the basement there was a big weapons, well, not a big arsenal, but, there were some shotguns in there locked away. And it's like, oh, so I'm going to get a shotgun. I'm going to give it to my secretary, and I'm going to send her in to take care of the situation. And then I stepped outside and I said, no, you're not going to do any such thing. You are not going to give a civilian a gun and send them into a room with an armed, obviously deranged Vietnam War veteran with lethal combat skills. That is not what you do. You are a sheriff. You have been trained to use a weapon. Your secretary is a civilian. This is not how this works. Plus, of course, to protect and to serve. It's your job to do this. And so I just basically said no. And the secretary then chimed in saying, well, you know what, Sheriff, you are a coward. And so, we moved on, blah, blah, blah. So he basically then decided to look himself. Nothing happened. The guy kept shooting, but basically at the wall. You couldn't see what he was shooting at because of the way the room was laid out. And then he basically jumped out the window, through the glass, and ran away. So then the next day, this player complained to me in an email saying that I hadn't basically, that it was impossible for a game master to shut down a player's ideas. And I said, well, of course I can shut down any player's ideas if they violate certain rules. And realism and consistency is a very, very important rule. And you totally violated that rule because you behaved in such a way that no sheriff worth their salt would behave. You do not ever send a civilian who has no weapons training and who's also not trained for this and who's also not contracted to do this, to do your dirty work. Also, I mean, I was a manager for 13 years. If you have a direct report that you've given a task to and they completely have a meltdown when they're doing the task or after finishing it, you don't assign that task to anyone else. You go in there and you try to find out what the problem is. And that means looking at the task, exposing yourself to that experience to try and find out what the hell is going on. Now, okay, I'm 46, this guy was 20. So, you know, there is a huge difference again in life experience. And it's very difficult not to bring your life experience into a game or your lack of life experience. But to actually do it this way was so absolutely over the top. But the reason was he wasn't doing it because he didn't realize that this is not what a sheriff would do or wouldn't do, because he didn't really see this. He was just like, it's a player's idea, you have to accept all players' ideas. And I said, no, I don't have to. And he said, well, then I don't want to game with you anymore. I said, well, that's very good. Then don't. So basically, I removed him from the group. I explained to the group what had happened. The group replied. They were like, well, yeah, we thought it was totally over the top and we didn't like what he was doing. And we actually felt that your reaction was spot on, that you basically then stepped out of the game and said, no, you're not doing this because it just doesn't work like this. And then we kept playing and it worked out well. So the fact that he was then replaced with somebody else who basically was found by one of the players who was still in the game. And they said, well, you know, I might have someone and would you accept someone else because we think it's just going to be 2 more sessions. I'm like, yeah, if you have somebody, please invite them. I don't care. If you feel that they would enjoy this, bring them in. They did enjoy themselves immensely. And actually what they enjoyed, because so far they've mainly been playing fantasy role-playing games, and I quote from a reaction that they had was, it is really cool to be able to think logically and think about what would make sense in a situation instead of having to think about what would the dwarf say to the elf. And I think this really nails it. If you are going to play a game, you want realism and you want consistency. And this consistency can be created in a fantastical world that doesn't exist, that's completely imaginary, if you obey the rules. And the rules have to also be established. So if you play DSA and you are a blessed one of Rondra, then just going into a frenzy and killing unarmed civilians just doesn't work. I mean, you can do it, but there will be repercussions. And the repercussions will probably be that the goddess walks away from you, takes away your carnal energy, and you will not be able to be, you won't be blessed anymore, so you won't be able to tap into this power anymore that has been bestowed upon you by the goddess. But also, you wouldn't do this. It would take a lot of magic to make you do this. You can influence somebody to the degree that they might do things that they wouldn't normally do. But it is very dark magic, it's very problematic, and it's also frowned upon by many people. But there are people who are very much into black magic and who do this. But it has to be consistent within the game world. And if you play in our world, then of course our rules apply. So if the sheriff had said, oh, and now I'm going to start flying around, I'm like, no, you're not going to start flying around. What makes you think you can fly? You know. But in DSA, for example, there are people who can fly. They can turn themselves into animals that can fly, or they can fly using implements such as a flying carpet, or if you're a witch, you can have a broomstick or something like that. but then it's consistent within the world. If I do not have this ability, I can't fly. And if I think, oh, it would be so awesome if my character could fly, you can't just add this to your list of abilities. You don't have that ability. It's not yours to use. And that's what I think about realism in games. And I think for me, in order to be able to play a game, I need to see the realism. I'm very happy to suspend my disbelief with regard to what is possible in the world and what isn't possible in the world. But what's a real turn-off is if I find out there are no rules, or if the rules are made up as we go along, or rules are completely changed. And I'm not talking about game mechanics, but in-game world rules, just because they thought it was cool. Okay, so that was my take on realism in games, and I wish you a pleasant rest of the day. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.